Hi class, I'm at it again with the final regulations PowerPoint. So today we're going to talk about NTSB 830. So when things don't quite go to plan and there are accidents or serious incidents or things of that nature, what are we as pilots required to do? Are there any reports we have to make? Do we have to preserve pieces of the wreckage? Those sorts of things. And of course, in order to know what we need to do, we have to understand first what an accident is or what a serious incident is. So let's go ahead and get into it. So, as we hopefully all of us have been preaching from day one, right? Safety is our number one objective. When we are training you guys, we always try to make sure that we do that in a safe manner. We take weather into account, right? We take aircraft condition and airworthiness into account. We take into account how we as flight instructors are feeling. Sometimes we might ignore that when we shouldn't, right? But as pilots, hopefully we're just looking at the bigger picture and making sure that everything is leading towards safety. So that's something that we teach you guys from day one, and hopefully that will stick with you, right? The overall objective of aviation as an industry is to be safe but also efficient, right? So we can't really sacrifice safety for efficiency. If anything, it's going to be the other way around. Okay. So all of the regulations we've talked about so far help us to go towards those goals. They are designed to limit our privileges or improve our privileges when we have shown that we are worthy of those, right? Or they give us general guidance as to what we should do and what we should not do. So when we talk about accidents and incidents, safety is what's been compromised, right? We're trading, again, that safety for efficiency when things like that happen. So, a popular way that we kind of look at accidents is on a multi level platform in something called the Swiss cheese model. So, in any organization, there is a structure going from the head of the organization or business all the way down to the workers. And in our case, because we're a college, it further extends down to the students. So, you have everybody on their respective levels that have their respective tasks to do. The chief flight instructor of the school enforces rules and things like that. They communicate with the FAA and see what needs to be changed in that domain. Assistant chiefs take what the chief puts in order, and they also enforce that. They also lead teams, so they tell their flight instructors what they should be doing. They check in on their flight instructors, and they are the next step up, right? If a student has a concern or an issue, they should definitely go to the team leader if the flight instructor is ignoring them. And then we step down to the flight instructor level, where we should be offering you guys safe and effective training. Right? We want you guys to grow in terms of knowledge and experience, but in a safe way. And then it's you guys, right? The students. So everybody has their own respective level, and on that level, they have their own duties. Accidents usually happen when there is a problem on every single level. And I don't really mean a fundamental or structural problem. I mean like a one-time problem, right? So let's say, I don't know, the FAA tells us as a flight school to do something, and the chief gets too busy and forgets about it, or just kind of brushes it aside because it's not that big a deal. Well, then that affects the rest of the chain, right? The assistant chiefs or team leaders, they don't know to enforce that particular thing. They might already know about it, but because it hasn't been reinforced or anything like that by the chief, then they probably won't enforce it as much as they should. Then the flight instructors don't really enforce that as they should. And then you guys don't get whatever should have been reinforced. So when we have something that creates a hole in every single layer, and those holes all line up, that is what leads to an accident. If we think about Colgan Air, when the NTSB did their investigation of this particular instance, it happened in 2009, and the overall cause was an aerodynamic stall, but there are a lot of other factors that went into that. when they looked into their investigation, they found that there's a problem on every single level. So the reason why the stall happened was because of improper pilot response to a stick shaker warning. That's a system that's built into the airplane to communicate to the pilots that it is close to a stalled condition. Um, Instead of lowering the nose to decrease that angle of attack to get away from that critical angle of attack, what the pilot did, the captain in this case, he decided to pull back, which just made that condition that much worse and caused that stall to happen. And they just didn't have enough time to recover. So that was one facet of that. The NTSB also learned from listening to the black boxes and things like that that the pilots were tired, they were fatigued, and partially this was because of commuting. So the first officer had to commute, I believe, all the way across the country. So this flight, I can't remember where it left from, but it was somewhere on the East Coast, I believe. It might have left out of Newark, I believe. But she lived out in, I think, Washington, and she had to literally commute cross country just to show up at work. So that was a factor, and then that got the NTSB and the FAA looking into the Colgan Air company policies and things and the pay, and none of that was good. And there were just so many problems, right? On a management level, Colgan Air was just unsound as an airline. And then if we broaden the scope, right, and kind of turn the mirror on the regulatory bodies, it was found that the FAA was kind of ignoring some issues that were reoccurring in the aviation industry at the time. So you can see how everybody did something that they weren't supposed to do and they let something kind of slip so that they had that hole. And in this particular unfortunate instance of Colgan Air Flight 3407, all of those holes lined up and this accident happened. So I mean, it doesn't take much for that to happen, right? So we have to make sure that we're doing what we need to do on our respective level. So this particular instance was important in the aviation industry because that's where the 1500 rule came from. So now you need 1500 hours. The NTSB and the families of the victims pushed for some sort of legislation that increased the amount of pilot training time because they were kind of shocked to figure out how low some of those pilots were in terms of experience. You had people moving up from first officer to captain, I think, within the first year of employment at Colgan Air, and these people didn't have, I don't know, usually any more than 300 to 500 hours. So it was kind of bad, all right, but it was a chance to kind of reflect. So they added the 1500-hour rule, and the reason why the NTSB was able to launch this investigation quickly and come to a conclusion in a fairly short time frame. Sometimes investigations take several months or years is because somebody let them know that something happened. So an accident like this was kind of impossible to ignore for bystanders and other people on the ground because it created a fireball. The aircraft crashed into a neighborhood in Buffalo, so it was right there, and I can imagine, or I can only imagine, how many calls were placed and everything. Um, but part of NTSB 830 is knowing when we have to make these reports. We have to let the NTSB know that something has happened or something that likely has happened. So NTSB 830.5 says that if something like an accident or a serious incident happens, or an aircraft is overdue, and you have reason to believe that they might have been involved in an accident or an incident, you need to notify the NTSB immediately. And apparently, it says, quote unquote, by the most expeditious means available. So my guess would be telephone, give them a call, something of that nature. But yes, so we now need to know what an accident is and what a serious incident is. Because if we don't know that, then we don't know when to make these reports. An aircraft accident, by definition, is anything that happens between the time you enter the aircraft with the intention of flight to the time where you disembark from the aircraft. Something that causes a person to die or receive serious injuries or basically negatively affects the characteristics of the airplane. So substantial damage is what I mean by that. So if something happens and you're intending to fly, so like if you're at SIU, if you go out on the ramp and you do the pre-flight and everything, your flight instructor comes out and meets you, and you guys get in the airplane, and I don't know, something happens. Let's say, I don't know, an airplane misses runway 24, or they have some sort of engine failure and they're off to the left side, and they absolutely destroy the back of the airplane. So you guys are fine. There's no injuries, there's no death or anything like that. But both those airplanes involved would have received substantial damage more than likely. And because you had the intention of flying, and you haven't taken off yet or anything like that, but because you had the intention of flying, it would be considered an accident. Yes, anytime serious injury, death, or substantial damage occurs is an aircraft accident. So death, the more appropriate term for that would be fatal injury. So fatal injury is something that, or an injury received that causes a person to um, die within 30 days of the accident. So they don't have to die on the scene or anything like that, but if they suffer burns or something like that, or internal bleeding, or like broken bones, just something really major, and they die within 30 days of the accident, that counts as a fatal injury. One of the, I would say, most sensical examples of this is 9/11. Right, so because there are aircraft involved, it became an accident, right? So all the aircraft involved that day received substantial damage. So they were just unflyable after that. They weren't even recognizable. People died that day, so that cemented that particular day as an aircraft accident. And then there were people in the towers, right, as a result of the airplanes crashing into them. There are people that got out, but they had inhaled enough smoke to the point where they died within 30 days of 9/11. And those fatalities would be listed on the report. So those count as fatal injuries as a result of the aircraft accident of flight United Flight 175, and then American Airlines Flight 11. Okay. So yeah, kind of somber, but that's the nature of that. So serious injury, HIBOB is the acronym we use to remember that. And all this includes is hospitalization, and the hospitalization has to happen for more than 48 hours within 7 days of the accident. Internal bleeding, so if they take a scan and there's a lot of blood inside that's been lost, that counts as a serious injury. You've got muscle, tendon, or nerve damage. So my guess is if you're already bleeding inside, you've probably got one or more of those other conditions going on at the same time. Broken bones, so this doesn't include like simple fractures or small bones. So if you've got like a hairline fracture in your arm, that's not going to count. If your nose is broken, your toes, your fingers, those are not going to count. And that kind of makes me mad. I'm a pianist. I need my fingers to be working properly, so how dare you not consider that a serious injury? But it doesn't count. O is organ damage. So if you were, I don't know, impaled by the throttle or something that broke off, and it just absolutely impaled your liver, that's going to count for that. And then burns of either the second or third degree, or burns of any degree that cover 5% or more of the body. Okay, so HIBOB, so hospitalization, more than 48 hours within 7 days, internal bleeding, broken bones, organ damage, and burns. Right, I'm sitting here with my eyes closed because I just have this burned into my memory. That's what you guys should do with this information, is just go over it until you can't forget it. Okay. So HIBOB for serious injury, and then substantial damage is kind of misleading because there's a lot of things that you would think would count as substantial damage that don't. So anything that adversely affects like the strength or the flying characteristics of the airplane is considered substantial damage. But bent fairings or the cowling, dented skin, ground damage to the propeller blades, wheels, tires, brakes, and wingtips, none of that is considered substantial damage. So a lot of that you would think would be substantial damage, but it's just not. So In other words, if the aircraft is involved in a situation and the aircraft is unflyable after that, and it doesn't, and the things that make it unflyable are none of these things at the end of this slide, then that would count as substantial damage to the aircraft. Okay, if you have to write off an aircraft, that is definitely substantial damage. So that Asiana Airlines 777 that crashed in San Francisco because they got too low, that aircraft had to be written off. So that's what substantial damage is. And then if we talk about serious incidents, so all of that stuff we talked about before is what makes an aircraft accident an accident. But now we're talking about serious incidents. And we use another acronym, CFI Tom, $25,000. Okay, so I guess the way you can think about it is CFI Tom makes $25,000 a year. That might be a little easier to remember and understand. So C is collision in flight. So midair collision, there was a PSA flight out in California back in the 80s, I want to say. I don't remember the flight number, but Pacific something Airlines. The PSA flight collided with a Cessna 172. That's a good example of that. I believe in class I mentioned the Uberlingen midair collision, which happened over Germany, and that's where a DHL cargo jet crashed into I want to say it was a Tupolev or there's another Russian manufacturer of jets, but those two airplanes crashed because one of them listened to ATC rather than the Traffic Collision Avoidance System, or the TCAS, and they collided and that killed everybody. So those are examples of that. Fire in flight, so if something's on fire in the airplane, that counts. Incapacitation of required crew. So if you are in a two-pilot airplane and the captain, let's say, passes out or has a heart attack, I think I heard of something up in O'Hare happening where the captain, I think, had a heart attack and he, I think, passed away before they were able to make it back to the airplane. But anything like that, that would count. If you're out on a dual flight and you're just a student pilot, then if something happens to your CFI, that would be grounds for that because they're the only ones who could legally be PIC in that particular instance. So that would count. And then if you've got a turbine ejecting FOD outside of the exhaust path, that's another example of that. Overdue aircraft. So if there's an aircraft that's been gone for a while that you are expecting back, I believe if it's overdue for more than 7 days, that's when you would notify the NTSB. I need to check on that though. But overdue aircraft, malfunction of flight controls. So let's say you have an elevator cable snap. So every time you pull back on your flight controls, the tail doesn't go up like it should, or the elevator doesn't go up like it should. That would count. And then anytime something other than the airplane is damaged to the point where repair would cost more than $25,000. So if you are landing and you lose control and you go off runway and you crash into a hangar and the insurance agent who walks out there rates the damage to be $30,000 worth of damage to the hangar, that would count. If let's say you only did $10,000 of damage to the hangar, but you did I don't know, $20,000 worth of damage to your airplane, that's not going to cut it, right? That is $30,000 of damage together, but the property separate from the aircraft has to incur $25,000 worth of damage or more. So collision in flight, fire in flight, incapacitation of required crew, right? Turbine ejects FOD outside the exhaust path, overdue aircraft, malfunction of flight controls, and then damage to property other than the aircraft rated at or above $25,000. So this situation here, this happened a couple years ago. This was a Southwest flight, and what happened here was the aircraft was flying along at 32,000 feet. They were climbing, the left engine failed. When the failure happened, parts of the engine cowling broke off, and fragments from inside the engine were basically catapulted at the fuselage, and it broke a window off at row 14, causing rapid depressurization of the aircraft. So the crew went ahead and initiated an emergency descent and tried to get it back to Philly as quickly as possible. Um, they were successful in landing, but there was a passenger who was basically blown part of the way out of the broken window, and they were able to pull the victim back inside, but they could not resuscitate the victim. Right, so the passenger died after being admitted to a local hospital for treatment. Okay, so there are 8 other passengers who sustained minor injuries. Okay, with all of that information there, we have to consider or in this situation, did they have to immediately notify the NTSB? So let's think about some things, right? We know that the engine failed and that caused a piece of the engine to leave somewhere outside of the exhaust path, right? So it was basically shot out to the side towards the fuselage, right, and broke that window. So we know that happened, and that goes under serious incident. Okay, so as of right now, yes, there is a requirement to notify the NTSB. But if we continue to go into it, remember that passenger who was almost blown out of that window completely when the rapid depressurization happened, they died, right, after being admitted to a local hospital for treatment. And that was definitely within 30 days of the accident. Okay, so that happened. I don't know the details of the 8 other passengers sustained minor injuries. I'm guessing because, and this is just Wikipedia, of course, so I don't know if they understand or whoever wrote this understands that there's a difference between minor injuries and serious injuries. So maybe those are just injuries that don't count as serious. Okay, we have a death as a result of this, and a piece of FOD, or FOD stands for foreign object damage, I think, FOD. But anyway, it's a piece of the engine that didn't follow the exhaust path, it went elsewhere. So for both those reasons, I would call this a serious incident as well as an accident, right? Um, so remember, these people were in flight already. And again, if this had happened when they were, I don't know, pushing back, right? If everybody was on and they had the intention of flying and they hadn't yet left the ground, and this happened and it struck a passenger the wrong way and they died, they had a serious injury, that would definitely count, okay? So the fatal injury makes it an accident. Right. You could also tack onto this the fact that the aircraft sustained substantial damage. So that missing window caused the aircraft to be unable to maintain that higher pressure inside compared to the outside. So you could argue that the aircraft is not going to be able to do what it needs to do in flight. So it adversely affected the characteristics of the airplane. So that might also count as substantial damage. Okay, so now that we know what accidents and serious incidents are, we can look at like what the report needs to look like. So all of this kind of makes sense, right? You should put in the type, the nationality, the registration marks of the aircraft, name of owner, operator if you know it, right? Name of PIC. If you're a bystander, you're probably not going to know that. But again, NTSB 830 is a little bit more centered and focused on pilots who are operating as PIC or SIC or whatever, some part of the required crew. This is something that we should know about. If you are a bystander and you see something happen and you know about this regulation, there's nothing that binds you to this, but of course, it would be a good idea to at least make an emergency call, right? Include as much information as you can about it. If you're there and you can help people safely, maybe do that until the first responders get there. I don't know. It just depends on what happened, right? So all this information, for the most part, makes sense, right? There's some additional things like what the aircraft had aboard. We don't know, right? Aside from people, that's kind of easy to tell if there's people, but radioactive materials, I have no idea, right? And you probably wouldn't either. A general description of what happened, right? So the nature of the accident. Did it happen on takeoff, climb out? Did you see fire trailing from an engine? Was it clear that the aircraft was breaking up into pieces? Things like that, right? The weather and the extent of the damage to the aircraft, and then number of persons aboard. Again, probably not bystander information, but if you are PIC or SIC, you will have to know these numbers, right? And this information. So once you submit the report, if you're there and you can do these things, then make sure that you help people out of the wreckage, right? You should try to preserve the wreckage so that the NTSB has a clear picture um, to work with, so they can figure out what happened. But if you have to move some of the wreckage to help someone, definitely do that. Okay. And then try to keep people away from it. You know how people are in this society. They'll pull out phones and try to involve themselves in stuff, but try to keep people away, especially if you've got things like a fire going, where there's leaking jet fuel, just things that pose a hazard to bystanders. And then everything relating to that particular flight you need to hold on to until they tell you otherwise. So if you've got a manifesto from that particular flight, you've got weight and balance calculations or an ATC clearance, like an IFR clearance that you wrote down or printed out or something, all of that you need to hang on to until the NTSB says they don't need you to do that anymore. So NTSB 830 isn't really like intense. It's not crazy. Um, I would say the main things just know what an accident is, right? So the substantial damage, right? The fatal injury or the serious injury, all of those things have to occur sometime within the time frame of the passengers and everybody boarding the aircraft with the intention of flight to the time where they leave the aircraft after they get done flying. So if it happens anywhere in that time frame, then those things make it an accident. Serious injury, remember high Bob, so hospitalization for more than 48 hours within 7 days. You've got internal bleeding, broken bones, toes, fingers, and your nose do not count. Simple fractures don't count either. Organ damage, burns, right? Second or third degree burns are an automatic serious injury, but if any type of burn takes up more than 5% of your body area, your skin surface, that also counts. So high bob for serious injury, and then anything that causes somebody to die within 30 days of the accident counts as a fatal injury. This obviously can't be something outside of the accident, right? So if somebody walks away like perfectly fine and then they, I don't know, they die for some other reason within 30 days, that's not going to count as a fatal injury, but it has to be derived from the aircraft um, accident. Okay, and then a serious injury, or not serious injury, a serious incident also requires immediate notification to the NTSB. And that's, remember, CFI Tom makes $25,000 a year. So you have the collision in flight, so mid-air collision basically, fire in flight, incapacitation of required crew member. You've got the turbine damage, ejects FOD outside the exhaust path. You've got an overdue aircraft. You've got flight control malfunction or malfunction of the flight control, so it fits with the acronym. And then damage caused to property other than the airplane that exceeds $25,000. Those are your main things to remember. Um, Practice this, work on it, write it down as many times as you need to. Say it to yourself if you need to. That's how I study. It's weird talking to yourself. It's weird talking to you guys because you're not really here right now and I'm sitting in a room by myself, but um, figure out what works, right? As long as it works, it's fine. Okay. And always, always, always ask questions if you have any. I'm here, reachable via email, text, come to my office, whatever you want to do, right? I'm here to help you guys. Okay.